All right. Welcome, folks. We are going to start getting to the point here where we're working towards making our app build for this unit, which is the, I think it's the Apple Pie app that we're working towards. But if you look at the teacher's book here, right, and that's the one that I'm using, it does have kind of all these keynotes talking about all these different topics here. And I'm going to do my best to go through this as quickly as I can, because this is kind of like necessary knowledge for kind of getting into building the app. So I just pointing that out basically. So I'm going to bring up the keynote and we're just going to talk through this as quickly as possible. And then we'll hopefully get to starting an app at least today. We'll see. All right. So in this particular one, we're going to start learning about a little bit more of the architecture of building apps. So like one thing that we did in the previous course is we just kind of did stuff. We followed instruction. It was very, very guided. I mean, this is too, but we also are trying to deepen your understanding of how all of this works. So we are going to be working with putting graphical components on the screen. And whenever you're working with that, every different kind of coding platform, operating system, or tools that you use have different terminology they use and different things, but there are some commonalities. And then we can apply some of those to, what we're doing here in Swift, but there's some kind of unique aspects too. The first thing that we're looking at on this screen is what we call, views that are basically common. Like what do those look like? So when we start throwing around these terms and you go, oh, that's just one of these, so when we say a navigation view, that's going to be one, and that's one that we will work with, I think, in this app, is one where we can kind of navigate around our app and it'll have certain things on the screen. So like notice, for example, you can see like the app or like the phone system menu at the top, and then ways to navigate around whatever screen you're on, including like an edit menu and an add button and who knows what else. You have the custom view hierarchy, right, where it's like something that you can predetermine yourself and make it custom, right, like what goes on that screen. You have what we call assembled views, which are the byproduct of your code running. So your code will run, produce some output, and then that's what goes to the screen. So it depends on your code. We have just this generic concept we call the window. I think that's pretty intuitive. And then we also have at the bottom here, notice what we call a tab bar view. So these are just real common formats that we kind of work with. Whenever we're working with any objects on the screen, of course, we always have the attributes inspector off on the right-hand side of Xcode, kind of helping to guide us. But some of the things that we're concerned with, at least at this point, are the ones you see on the screen. So we're looking at individual properties of objects on the screen, and the size, like the width and height. I mean, that's all that means. Position, where it's placed on the screen, right? And that sometimes is very important. Other times you take the whole screen, sometimes you take a portion of the screen, depends on the object, right? Alpha, or in this case, if you're a graphics person, you already recognize that term, but non-graphics people don't. Alpha typically refers to what we call opacity. So how see-through something is. So I can put something on the screen and it can be 100% opaque, meaning I cannot see through it, or I can scale that back to a percentage of 100%. And then that's how much you can see through the object to what's behind it, right? And so if you ever are on a web page or an app and you can kind of see through something, that's the setting. That's usually a value between 0 and 1. That's typically how we operate it. Web people will also recognize that one because we use that web too. Like when we do like RGBA, for example, we do call it alpha. It comes from the graphics world. We'll look at background colors, and we'll also look at the tag. And the tag's an interesting one. It says an integer that you can use to identify view objects. So in other words, if we have like 20 things on the screen, we can number them. And so this should kind of tell you something right there. if you start numbering the objects on your screen, you're kind of indexing them, but it's also a way to refer to the object so that we can kind of get to it more quickly if we need to. I haven't really used that one much here, but I have used that in other languages, by the way. We also will start working with different types of stuff that we put on the screen. We've done this stuff already, right? So some of this is review, but just to kind of explain what some of the objects are, right? So we're going to go through a lot of different user interface objects here, and then some of the common properties that go with it. When we put a label on the screen, a label is simply a way to put words on the screen, is a good way to say it. Words that aren't like on a button or some other type of control, they're just words, right? We call them a label because often, this kind of comes from form building, where sometimes we'd have a box that you type text into, and the label is the thing next to it describing it. So we often think of, text on the screen is just describing something, right? So even if you look at like this attributes inspector here, for example, there's a checkbox here. The word enabled is labeling the checkbox, right? So that's kind of what we mean by a label. Here's some of the common settings for labels, and I'll just let you kind of look at those. And because it's text that's inside there, this is where you can control that. That second field right here, that's where we name the object and make it unique. And when you first drag it onto the form, it'll just be called label, right? But that name becomes important because the name you apply here to the label, you can use in your code to refer to the object directly. There's also the image view. That was one of the first ones we got to play with way back early on. Here's some of the properties for that. And mostly what you put in there is the image, right? There's also a highlighted image too. So like if you click on it, what does it look like when you click on it, for example? It could be the same image with the overlay, or, who knows? There's also a text view, and a text view is basically for longer blocks of text, right? And notice where all that text goes, but this has the capability to have multiple lines of text, where the label command usually is like a line or two or three. You can make that bigger and taller, but that's not usually what it's used for, right? So if you have lots of words to put on the page, this is a good mechanism, a text view. There's also a scroll view, and I know it's really hard to see in this graphic here, but if you look at the screen, you can get scroll bars basically. So this is an object where you put content into it, regardless of what kind it is, where if the content exceeds the bounds of the container or the scroll view, there are scroll bars, both horizontal and vertical, so you can maneuver around that screen. Hard to see here, but you can kind of see the white line there and the white line here, which are your scroll bars. Some settings for those too that go with, I think is kind of interesting. We have table view, and this is kind of interesting. So table view is where we take objects, and this is a really common app problem, right? So you have a bunch of stuff you want to put on the screen, and you want to make it look nice and orderly, right? Like, so it lines up nice and it's in columns or whatever. A table view is one that we use very often. So not dissimilar, like if you're a web person, right? We use tables in web too. Normally tables are meant for just displaying data, but what a lot of web designers figured out is like it's a really kind of a nice way to even take graphics and get them to line up, or at least be consistent looking. Same thing happens here inside of an app. So table view. So the screen that you're seeing here on the left, that was created with a table view, and you can see this is one singular column, and it's real orderly. It creates for a nice layout. Some of the training that I just did recently, which was the third level training, they were trying to move away from using the table view as like an approach, but it is still very, very heavily used. So it'll be kind of interesting to see where that one goes. Some of the settings that go with that one too. Then there's toolbars, right? So if you want, and this is really pretty cool, you can add stuff like this to your apps, right? And you notice like even the icons that are inside here, these are common icons we see in most of our iOS apps, right? I mean, so if you have an iPad or an iPhone, you bring up some whatever app, not unusual to see a toolbar like this, on the side, on the bottom. There are kind of very Mac ways to do things. And yeah, some of that stuff can actually be somewhat automatically generated too, right? You can bring the whole toolbar in, decide what buttons are on it. And, you can choose its settings, so different sizes for the toolbar. In this case, this one's translucent, so it can sit over background content, etc. Right. The other thing you can do is you can kind of design this to include either pre-built system items. So if there's like for example, a save or a delete, that kind of thing, or if you have some custom button that you're designing that triggers a custom action, you can put that all in there. And then you see some of these things can also be preset down here. Now we also do have what we call navigation bars, and notice the highlight up here at the top, right? That's the navigation bar. And it's just basically a way to kind of move around your app. So if your app, okay, so let's backtrack a second here. Most of what we've built so far, right, using Swift is like one screen comes up and everything happens on that one screen, pretty much, right? We had the Element quiz app, which I think sort of put different stuff on the screen, but really it was still the same view. When we're working with navigation bars, the implication is that we have multiple screen views that we're using. And think about the apps you use. That's pretty normal, right? Like you run an app, you hit a button, something happens, and a different screen comes up, right? And then sometimes you click to go back, kind of like a web browser or something. But that is called the navigation bar. And when you're building an app, that's one thing that we'll learn is really important, is adding a navigation view, adding a navigation bar, and then wiring it all up to work, right? So like, hey, when I click this, it should go back to settings, that type of thing, right? So what stuff you put up here, once again, is highly dependent. And then, like where you choose to put it, what it looks like, how it behaves is all controlled from the attributes inspector. We also have what we call the tab bar, not too much different than the one that we saw before. But there are some differences to this in terms of like where this gets placed and what it's used for and what stuff you put inside of it. So similar, but not quite the same. All right. So that was all the user interface elements. Now we go to the controls. And when we start talking about controls, and most languages will call these user interface controls. Jonathan, I know like you right now, you are taking my Java 2 class where we're doing, or at least up until this point, we're doing very similar things. And they call it the same thing, right? So they have user controls because these are the things that users will typically manipulate inside of an application, basically to run the application, right? There's a button, you press it. And so a button becomes one real common way to do things. So buttons can be configured to look differently. And you see they have two sets of them highlighted here. So you can make them real big. You can make them real small. You can style them. You can do all sorts of stuff. What do buttons do when you click them? Well, the answer is it depends. Depends on what you're wiring it up to do, and that's where we'll get into doing, IB outlets and actions and functions and all those things, right? So, you still have to write code to make it do something. We have what we call segmented controls. We played with one of these too in the Element app quiz, if you remember, and that's where you have it's kind of like tabs, basically. So when I click each one of these, different stuff will appear on the screen. The truth is we're still all on the same screen, right? But this is basically unveiling a different set of controls, segmented control. There's also text fields. That's usually, I think of that as one of the more basic interface fields because it's one of the first ones that was developed. And that is if you're doing your GUI app, as a user, where do you type your stuff in, right? And a text box is one of them. That has a lot of settings too. Some of the kind of interesting ones, and maybe you guys haven't seen these or noticed them before, but like you can kind of control how that field behaves, right? So you can have it capitalize, you can have it spell check, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I think that's really, really fascinating that you have that level of control there. Of course, what settings you make is really relevant to what you're doing in the app, right? Like what's the logical thing that you're doing that requires that activity. But that is a place you can do it. Most of the setting, and this is an aside now, but whenever you see any of these things in the attribute inspector, and I mean, you're basically, you go in there, you click a button or move a slider or type in a value or choose from a list, right? To control an object on the screen. But interestingly, all the stuff you see on that screen there is also controllable through code. So you can write code that controls it as opposed to making a selection on the box. Normally what's happening is you're presetting its default for how it appears on the screen when it first pops up. And then you write code that might change something here, right? Some things you might change, some things you might not, right? But that's kind of the general lay of the land. We do also have sliders, right? So these are real common kinds of controls as well. You can set, for example, this one controls volume or ringer volume, but you can have it set default values here too, like minimums, maximums, and whatever. It doesn't have to go from 0 to 100%. It could go from 20% to 40%. You know, I mean, that's all up to you to determine as you're writing your app. We also have switches. You know, these are just simple on-off toggles. We've used these in apps before too. And you know, very simple controls for that one. Here we also have a bunch of more advanced user controls. And one of them is a date picker. And this is kind of like I will say this is an older school date picker, and they do have some newer ones that they use now that look more modern. And they have other ones that are more like the ones you're used to, where the calendar pops up, you know, that kind of thing. But this works pretty well. These I think are particularly useful on a phone, because I think of like the way I set my alarm every night, you know, to wake up in the morning, is I have one of these where you like kind of scroll up and down on each one of the values. So that works pretty well too. But that's a date picker. That's a pre-built object you can just pull into your app. That's kind of neat. The other thing I think that's kind of interesting is if you want to read up on this stuff, right? You want a deeper dive on any materials, go to the Apple developer website. You can find the thing that you're looking for and read all the documentation to your heart's content if you're not sure what it does or have a question. I'm always a big fan of just trying it and see what happens, but it doesn't hurt to read too. You know, that's kind of a thing. All right. So that was lesson 7. We're gonna move on to I think they have these misnumbered, right? They're off by 1. All right. All right. So this particular keynote talks about the information that we drop onto the page, and the information could be an image, right? So that's for sure. So when we do put an image in, we have some controls over the images that maybe you guys have played with a little bit already. And I'm always like, you know, because I'm a web person, I always think about this kind of goofy stuff a lot. Like, hey, we have a space to put an image into, and we can get it all stretched and out of proportion. Like generally, I would say this is not good because you can tell it's stretched, right? And whenever I see this on a website, for example, it screams to me that the person doesn't know what they're doing with images. You know, that, you know, tells me like, well, all right, they might be able to make a web page, but they don't know how to get an image on there. Same thing happens with an app, and which selection you make makes a difference. So in this case, aspect fit gets it in proportion to fit in one direction. This one kind of, you can see it kind of like pushes the bounds a little bit. What would happen is only this part of the image would fill, but it would fill the whole space, right? So you see the outline. Those generally, I'm a big fan of, you just play with it and see what looks good, right? And then try a different device, flip your device, you know, horizontal and vertical, and see how it behaves, right? The other thing that's kind of interesting, you know, when we put images or really any content up on the screen, we have what we call safe zones on the screen, right? Like you know, I think this is really kind of a weird feature of all Apple devices. And you see this little like bump out they have here, which is like normally they have like a camera or two up here and maybe a microphone or something. Um, it is part of the screen space, but Apple kind of reserves it for themselves. Right? So you don't really want to put anything up here. The other thing that happens is sometimes, if you push stuff too close to the edges, it becomes either you're running the risk that either the person's like phone case will cover it, right? Or if you put a control or something there that their finger can't really land on it properly. And so we usually want to stay within kind of a range. Sometimes things do get cut off in ways we don't expect. And the only way we find out is by running the app and taking a look. I mean, basically. There are some settings in here, and that's what the point of this is, where you can go in there, and I don't know if you can read what it says there, but basically you can make it stick to certain parameters. And that's one thing that you play with a lot, is we start to learn that we can apply constraints to things on the screen to make them behave in a way that we expect, right? That's a little bit of an art. And frankly, it takes a lot of experience, I think, to kind of get it to work right. But you can see here how they clipped this or readjusted the image from one screen to the next. So it's a little narrower, which might not look as cool outwardly, but when you put it up on the phone, this will probably actually work better, So these are all considerations. Kind of going back to this little bump out thing. One thing I noticed that was kind of interesting is like right now I'm on a M2 MacBook Air, right? And I don't really have that bump out on my screen, but my wife, who's got I think also a newer M2 MacBook, like a more recent generation of it, that has that at the top of the screen. And I thought, wow, that was really an interesting design choice. I don't know why they did that. Probably to have consistency between the Mac OS and iOS, is my only guess. Right. Other things that can happen, right, is sometimes like you'll put text up on the screen and it'll get cut off like this, right? So you have to like figure out ways to kind of work around that. And a lot of it is with your attributes inspector and getting the settings correct. Now I am going to move on to the next section here, just try to get this stuff in. And this talks about when we're actually using the controls and doing things, and they're focusing on these four. And so when we start putting this stuff into code, what does it look like? So now you can see here that we can take a button, right, and drag it onto your view or whatever, and then you would connect that up in your code, right? You do your control drag or whatever. And then the default when I drag in a button is button tapped. So in other words, the moment somebody taps that button, the code inside here will execute. There are other actions related to buttons, but this is what we would call the default action, right? So, the user interface for this, once again, you see the controls that go with it. Not too much more to say there. If we had a switch, this is what the IB action looks like. And notice that if we use a switch, there's two states for it. So we want to write code that checks to see if it's on or off, and then do the code that it says relative to that. Sliders are one where usually, think about how you use a slider. You take it and you move it to one spot and then you leave it alone, right? And whenever we change that value of the slider, so this is the default action for a slider value changed, then we run some code. So once I move the slider, what's happening, right? What is that slider control? Notice with the slider, there's a bunch of settings. There's values, there's maxes and mins. And then you can also, and I think it's kind of neat, you can actually add images for max and min if you don't like what the system defaults are. Text fields, of course, if we use those, notice the default action for that one is if you just have a standalone text field is when the return key is tapped. So that's kind of a weird one because maybe for example, somebody's typing in a password and then you hit go or enter or whatever it is on your thing, this is the action that would happen. Right. And you can't take that for granted, right? So any action you do on the screen, you got to write code for it. It doesn't necessarily happen automatically. Some of the real common text field settings when we're working with stuff, in this case, the return key is here. You can also choose which keyboard type you put up on the screen, right? So if you ever wondered how that's done. So if you're asking somebody for numbers, you can just put up the number keypad. If you're asking somebody to type in their name, you put up the alphabet keyboard, right? Etc. So you can actually control which keyboard appears. So if you've ever used an app and went, why is this keyboard up here? Like they'll ask you to like type in like a numeric security code, but they put the alphabet up. It makes no sense, right? It's that kind of goofy stuff. And some of these other ones are pretty interesting. The placeholder one I think is very useful too, because you can kind of tell people what to type into a field before they do. And then you can also, like if you're generating a password field, for example, you can have it so that it echoes back characters that somebody can't like look over your shoulder and read. It's like, and that's pretty normal. You type in a password, it echoes back a character that is not the character you typed in. We have already experienced actions and outlets, but we're gonna ramp that up, of course. And so typically what we end up doing is we usually connect something as an outlet, meaning that it can receive information back and forth from the screen, and then we have an action associated to, which might also be related to a different thing. Sometimes a field can be both an outlet and an action, right? So that kind of gets weird too. Right, so that one is that, and then I think we have one more to go through here, maybe two more. We're gonna try to do these pretty fast. A lot of the stuff that we will do will kind of be pre-configured and we'll be told how to do it. But when you are working and designing stuff for mobile devices, you have this one complication that who knows what size the device is, right? You just don't know, right? And the unfortunate thing with iPhones and iPads is, they have like pro versions and regular versions and mini versions and, iPad Pro and mini and, whatever. And I'm going to tell you what, notice, those little like bump outs for the speaker and the camera, how they're on some devices, but not on the others. Some have bigger screens, smaller screens. And then you have the complication of vertical and horizontal, right? Yeah, that complication too. And you have to consider all of it, right? So ultimately you might build your app to be vertical first, because that's what most people use it as. But you know what? You need to consider the other direction as well. And you need to think about older devices. When you're working inside of Xcode, I think it's really helpful to set yourself to something that you can actually use that would be useful. We do have simulators built in that allow us to emulate most of the relatively modern versions of both devices. And it behooves you, and we will at times bring up alternate devices just to see what it looks like. Does this work on iPad? Right. Now, there are also some tools that are built in that do help you kind of automatically align things. And you guys have played with this stuff. So you put a button on the screen, you move it around, and these guidelines pop in, and they help you like center things on the screen, left to right, top to bottom. Or if you have other things on the screen, it helps you to align and position. It's all there to help you. And my recommendation is, line things up, center things, make it look good, because that invites users in. Here, and we'll play with these screens too, at the very bottom of the Xcode window, kind of off to the right, but to the left of the attributes inspector is the this weird little toolbar. One of them that we'll start to use a little bit is this constraints thing, which forces stuff to behave in certain ways on the screen, whether it's like a certain distance from something or that it's centered or whatever, right? Whatever the case may be, so that when we do switch from one screen to another, the stuff looks good, right? And the constraints can help with that. They can be tricky to work with. It does take practice. And I'm going to tell you what, the tool, I find this tool a little bit quirky, but the more I get used to it, I feel less weird about it. You can also create the constraints manually. And then when you create them, you'll have like in the left sidebar, kind of like a listing of the constraints. And if you don't like one of them, you can just delete it or edit it, right? So if you don't like what it's doing, it is changeable. You're not stuck with it. There are some times when like you run the app and the debugger will say, hey, you got some issues here. And it will allow you, like, once again, it'll show you the constraints as a list. Then you can either go in there and delete them, like highlight them and just delete them, or in some cases edit them. And I think that's pretty cool. Right. So they talk about the safe area. So you'll notice like this blue area here on the screen. So basically what they're telling you is, yeah, I can put objects way down here in the white or way up here at the top in the white, but it's probably not a good idea, And what they're really trying to say here is the safe area is that blue box, right? So as long as you put stuff inside that blue box, you can be assured that your users will see it. They have the same issue with television, by the way, not so much in the modern era, but in the old days, like whenever they'd put stuff on screen, they'd always have to make sure they stayed really far away from the edges of the screen, because they never knew if like somebody's screen was like highly rounded and would cut stuff off, right? And yeah, so that's I think pretty helpful. If you do get warnings about constraints, so you see these little error messages, you do need to pay attention to them. And really what we're trying to do, like in this example, is to get this thing centered. But if you look at that button, it really isn't. And this is telling you that something's off. So pay attention to that and fix them whenever you can. You can also set up constraints. And this is kind of interesting. Like if you're going to have like a list of objects, you can set up your constraints so that your objects are never closer than so many pixels or whatever, or that they're all horizontally centered relative to each other, that kind of thing. There is this thing called stack views as well, and this is kind of a structure. And what a stack view allows you to do is to put a lot of things, and basically, as the name sounds, layer things on top of each other inside of one window. So I can have a button kind of sitting over on the top of an image view, maybe, and that's usually done in a stack view. In this case, this stack view contains text. When you're putting stuff onto a screen, you're always thinking about how it aligns in one direction or the other, how evenly it's distributed, and the spacing that goes with it. And all of that's part of a stack view. There are classes to sizes. So in other words, we can make things small or compact, or what we call regular, right? Like it just takes up the screen, or let's squeeze it down. Or you can do it the other way, right? So how you adjust that, the point is you control all of this, like how it behaves when you move things around. So if you're vertical, there's a regular height. If you're horizontal, there's a regular height. And unfortunately, they're different. I don't know why when they came up with these devices, they're like, well, what if you want to flip it the other way? We should allow for that. Oh, okay, we'll write code for it, right? But what's happened really is it's made a nightmare for all the coders, because now you have to accommodate for two different views. And the correct way to do it, by the way, is really to have a separate view for each of these, but that does get complicated. If you write good code, you don't have to worry about that. Same applies to a phone, right? When we talk about compact height, then we're looking at older stuff, right? So if you want to make sure it works for older stuff, you stay in the compact ranges. If you want regular stuff, you go with the newer stuff. All right, and I think there might be one more here. Nope, I think that's it. All right, so we're gonna call it a day, folks. This video is going to end here. So that's just a preview of what we're going to need to know to go into that app build. So those are user interface components, and this recording ends here.